Good morning. Today is August 7th, 2024. My name is Atimanada George. I'm a Green Fellow with the American Folklife Center, a division of the Library of Congress. Under the auspices of the Green Fellowship, I'm interviewing Belinda Jackson Farrier. Belinda, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like you to tell us your origin story.
Sure. So I was born in Freeport, Texas, which is just near Galveston. And my mother at the time was an educator, and my father worked in the railroad industry. He later transitioned to the federal government, working for what is now the Federal Highway Administration. Uh, and so, as a result of his work, we as a family often moved throughout the United States. So, growing up, I went to like seven different elementary schools and one middle school, but then three different high schools. So, whether it's Arizona or Illinois or Missouri or South Carolina, we just lived all over. So, college was really an opportunity for me to kind of go to school in one place and stay and finish in one place. So I went to Spelman College, which is in Atlanta, Georgia, and I arrived at Spelman really interested in studying political science with a hope that one day I could uh, become a lawyer, work overseas for a big company. My interest at that time was Japan, and I'll go back in a moment to why. And then I would come back and get involved in politics. And so I had had an interest in politics all of my life. And even as a teenager, I had volunteered on political campaigns in Illinois, where we were at that time. And I had had an opportunity in high school to study abroad in Japan, where I tried to be a Senate aide for Paul Simon. But instead of going to DC for a summer, uh, I got an opportunity to go to Japan to learn about US Japan relations, 25 Senate aides. I got to go under this program between the US Senate and the Sony Corporation. And that was life changing for me. I had traveled overseas a little bit, mostly to the Caribbean and Mexico, just kind of in the hemisphere with my family on vacations. But I hadn't gone that far away and certainly not on my own. I didn't know anything about Japan before going. And I loved it. And I loved being there. While we were there, we visited the US Embassy. Walter Mondale was the ambassador at the time, and we heard him speak. I don't remember much about what he said, but I do remember being very impressed by the embassy and its location and thinking I could really work in a place like this, but not even knowing how one does that. And so I arrived at college having had that experience, knowing that I loved policy and politics, and just kind of pursuing my education from there. It is a couple of professors who came to me right before I was getting ready to study abroad in Japan, my junior year, and told me about a fellowship and an opportunity to get a scholarship from the Department of State, briefly become a diplomat, and then, and kind of get a graduate school degree and all of these things and try this career and then see where life took me after that. I thought it sounded amazing. I applied not thinking that I would get it. I I did get it, and it changed my whole life. I'm very thankful for what was then called the Foreign Affairs Fellowship, is now called the Pickering Fellowship. Uh, and at that time, undergraduates received it, so it paid for my last 2 years of undergraduate. It gave me internships in the summertime that helped me to learn about the Department of State. It paid for graduate school, and we'll get to that in a second. And then I was obligated to, I believe it was 6.5 years of working as a US diplomat. I still had to pass the Foreign Service exam, and there were all of these requirements. Um, And I just thought, like, great deal. I'll do this. It was kind of like an ROTC program, right? I'll serve my time, and then I'll still go to law school, and I'll go work for, Coca-Cola or something in Japan, and then I'll come back and I'll be a politician. But and so that was my plan. I went to graduate school at Syracuse University, and I studied Africa and development. So at Spelman, I had studied political science and Japan. I just decided to switch it up a bit in grad school. I came to Washington to do my last semester of graduate school. Syracuse has and continues to have a Washington semester that you can do. And my first day of class was 9/11. And my roommate and I had just moved into an apartment in Alexandria, Virginia. We were just off of 395, so we weren't too far away from the Pentagon. We were outside taking a walk when the plane hit the Pentagon. We not only heard, but we felt the explosion. And that changed a lot for me. Um, I won't belabor the point of 9/11 and how it changed so much for everyone. But for me, I finished graduate school that December. I was the first, I was part of the first class of new diplomats after 9/11. Like there was a class that was starting on that day, but we were the first class after 9/11. So I started in January 2020 or 2002. And everything was different. Like I think prior to 9/11, right, people, the way that so much about our foreign policy was different, so much about our perspectives on the world were different. Even the choices my entering class was given as to where we might go were very focused on the war on terror, and that just hadn't existed prior to that. So that is kind of what led me to the Foreign Service. One thing led to another, and the next thing you know, it wasn't 6.5 years that I stayed, but rather it was more like 20 and a half. But that is how I found myself at state.
Do tell us about your assignments, the nature of the work, where you served, and perhaps some of the highlights.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So when I came into that first class, most of my class was being assigned to Afghanistan. And there were a couple of spots in East Asia or Southeast Asia. But I was really insistent that I wanted to learn a world language. And, I came in with Japanese, but I wanted to do something different. And then I really, it was okay if I didn't go to Afghanistan at that time. So they sent me to El Salvador, which I like knew nothing about. And I hadn't studied Spanish. In high school, I had studied Latin. So uh, this was all very new for me. So I went to El Salvador for my first assignment where I worked on visas, and later they created a role of staff assistant for the ambassador. And so I later, towards the end of my assignment, became a staff assistant for our ambassador, who was a political appointee at the time. I had a wonderful time in El Salvador.
Could you
There are a lot of struggles there, right? Obviously, many people have left El Salvador. It is very difficult for everyday citizens, although that is changing. Um, but I was just able to build community with our local team. I made friends outside of the embassy. And of course, some of the friends that I made while I was working there, particularly in the consular section, working on visas, was they're still friends today. I highlight El Salvador because working on a visa line particularly in the post 9/11 environment where everybody was figuring out what this new world would look like. Uh, it just had a tremendous impact on me. I had to do a lot of growing up on the visa line. It was hard. We interviewed each of us, there were about 19 or 20 of us, and we each were interviewing more than 100 people a day. You only had seconds to figure things out. People were often quite emotional after their interviews, and that was really hard for me to adjust to. And there was, in the post 9/11 space, things kind of began at no, and people had to work their way to yes. That was the first time I had to confront policies that I maybe didn't always agree with. So that was a time of tremendous growth for me. I would also highlight then after El Salvador, I started a trend which kind of continued throughout my career of I never always followed the straight and narrow path that the department laid out for people. So my second assignment was actually back in Washington, which is untraditional. And I went to the operations center. I thought I wanted to go to US or to the US mission to the United Nations. Uh, but I was advised instead to try to give this thing called the State Department Operations Center a try. And I loved the experience. In the Operations Center, you never know what's going to happen day to day. It's like the department's 911 center. And it's like a nerve center for everything that's happening at state, similar to what the White House Situation Room is at the White House. And I loved being in that environment. I loved the pace. I loved how things were different constantly. And I loved being challenged and at the tip of the sphere of some just incredible, interesting historical events that I would not have been privy to or have experienced otherwise.
Could you
So,
give us an example?
sure. So, for example, that first tour I had in the Operations Center, I am the person who called and woke up Colin Powell to tell him that the tsunami in South Asia had happened, right? So we received information indicating that something terrible had happened in South Asia. I was kind of sitting in a role that night where I would be the person who had to call him. I was still relatively new. And remember, at this time, I'm like maybe 25 years old, just kind of 2 years into the State Department. And so both we're dealing with the news of what's just happened without the clarity, right? It's unfolding and dynamic. And I got to call Colin Powell, and I've never spoken to him before. And I'm just Belinda, right? Um, so the operations center, I found it to be a space that pushed and stretched me outside of my comfort zone and really helped me develop skills that I rely on today, right, as a leader and just in my professional experience now. So I left there. I was nominated to go to the White House Situation Room for a year. From there, um, I spent some time after the White House Situation Room working on. I wanted to work on Middle East issues again. At the time, we're still fresh out of 9/11. Operation Iraqi Freedom is starting, and so the eyes of the foreign policy establishment were very much on the Middle East. So I became a desk officer for Bahrain and Kuwait, because I really, again, I loved being in the middle of everything that was happening. Around that time, a couple of things happened. I got married, and I needed to I got married. I needed to think about an overseas assignment. I was technically a public diplomacy coned officer, but we've discussed at that point I hadn't done anything public diplomacy related. And so I needed to kind of find somewhere that was going to be okay for me and my husband, who was not at the state, working at the State Department at the time. His background is in public health. And uh, somewhere that ticked these other two boxes. I thought about going to Haiti, but instead it's a long story why, but I took an assignment in Togo in West Africa, and I became the public affairs officer there. It was a very small embassy. It was a very small public diplomacy section, but that was perfect for me, right? I had a section that I could be honest with my team about, hey, like you guys are the experts here on the ground. You have been doing this work for decades. I I want to learn and I want to be a constructive and valuable part of the team. And we're still close today. I still am in contact with most of the team, but I think we did incredible work in Togo. And because we were not, the eyes of Washington were not on us, we were able to do some really innovative things while we were out there without the scrutiny of Washington,
Give us
but
some
later earning the
examples.
accolades. Pardon?
Give us some examples.
Sure. So we were one of the first embassies to get a Facebook page, which now is just like, oh, you're supposed to get it. But then it was very controversial, right? So we kind of started that. We were one of the posts that helped to start that trend. We did a lot of work with mobile technologies. Um, we got the idea of using Kindles to download news items from around the world in English and French onto, and then we would do activities in areas that didn't have internet, which was in Togo at the time, most places. We were able to have English language learning discussions with people using real news items that people would not normally have had access to. So we were both providing people with a window into what the rest of the world was doing, because we were both limited by both internet access and news access in general, but also what was covered in French or local languages. And so this was helping to open the aperture for people of what was happening in the world. We started a really robust program and partnership with the local university, and even we began to have interns in our library from the local university, so that again, these interns could get access to our information, but could to know us, and indirectly could become almost ambassadors for us on their campuses. Like I have interacted with the Americans, and these are the kinds of things they're actually doing or what they're really talking about or what's really going on. They could be influencers in ways that we could not. So we started having spelling bees across the country, and people just really loved that program. And we touched thousands of kids with these spelling bees. Um, and really got to know communities and develop relationships with communities. When it was time for an election, which for many reasons is very complicated in Togo, due to some background issues, we worked with a local theater group to develop a play outlining for people both their rights in Togo in terms of voting, like what they were able to do. For example, they didn't need a local leader to tell them how to vote. In theory, they could make their own choice. Culturally, what they decided to do, they could do, but people didn't even know theoretically, in some spaces, people didn't know, and notionally, that they could not be told what to do, but they could make that decision privately. And we also used that play to just give people information about the logistics of voting, right? And so that group, they wrote the play, they produced it, right? We of course like approved it and helped fund it, but light touch, they went around and performed it. In the end, the UN partnered with us, the local UN. They were really impressed by it. It it made an impact and went places that I probably would not normally have been able to access, or if I was able to access it, it would have been in a very artificial environment, right? It wouldn't have been as impactful and real. So, look, we loved Togo. We actually thought about staying there a bit longer. We just had a wonderful time there. Uh, I came back from Togo. I went to be a special assistant for Richard Holbrooke when he was the like senior advisor for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And after he died, I went back to the operations center. I left actually a few weeks before he died, but um, I went back to the operations center to be a supervisor. I then did another public diplomacy assignment where or and I should say during that period where I was a what we call a senior watch officer in the operations center. That was during the Arab Spring, during WikiLeaks, during the it was right after the earthquake in Haiti, but there was a lot of Haiti stuff still happening during that period. And it was during the Fukushima crisis in Japan. So it was a very busy year. Very exciting year. I left there. I did a public diplomacy assignment in the Foreign Press Center, which serves as a liaison between foreign press and the State Department. And so I worked on Western Europe there. I also, around that time, had my daughter. When I finished that assignment, we went to Peru, where I was the cultural affairs officer. And I often tell people, like, that is the greatest job in the foreign service. Like, I tell people that, and then I run into people who were like, well, I was the cultural affairs officer in Egypt, or I was the cultural affairs officer in, Nepal. And then I'm like, okay, well, maybe. But being a cultural affairs officer in Peru is right up there with Egypt or Mexico or Nepal or something else. Um, First of all, I think just being a cultural affairs officer is just awesome. But one, I had the greatest team. I had an amazing boss. My peers were great. Our public diplomacy section at that moment, it just can't be replicated. We were great. And there were so many exciting things happening. Peru it was on the cusp of becoming a middle income country. Of course, and so they were having lots of visits and global events like COP or APEC and things like that.
Being
Oh, COP is it's the climate,
Conference of the Parties.
yeah, it's the climate conference that the UN hosts every year.
Mhm.
And so we were top 20. I think they're up to like something much higher by now. And APEC is what Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, something like that.
Sounds good.
It's it's the countries that touch the Pacific partnering on various things. So it's a massive conference that draws heads of state. COP is also a massive event that draws ministerial level uh, participants from around the world. And and I could go on and on with all of the things that they hosted, both regionally and from a global perspective. We were also a post that was on the map in terms of senior US government officials. So there were lots of visits from, whether it was from President Obama to Secretary Kerry to lots of folks from the Hill or other cabinet secretaries and things like that. So we were also very busy with visits. I don't have the metrics in front of me, but I want to say we had something like there was a year where we had something like 50 or 60 either congressional or higher level visits. Um, things that my team did there. I mean, Peru was a place where I really experimented with leadership best practices and building a team that felt safe to to innovate and think creatively. So it took like a year to build trust. I was there ultimately almost 4 years. It took a year or so to build trust with everyone. But then once we did, we were able to build an environment where people could come and say the impossible and we could make the impossible happen. And so examples would be, there's so many I'm trying to pick. Like, for example, there's a lot of damage to the Nazca lines or the Nazca lines, however you like to pronounce it. And it's very difficult to fix that damage because you can't step on the patina surrounding those lines because in theory, if your footprint, it's very similar to the surface of the moon. And so if you make a footprint, it will last for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we obviously don't want, so there's damage further out, but you can't get to it because you can't step on it. There's a period, I think, in the 60s or 50s and 60s where people were allowed to drive and dune buggy in certain parts of that area. And so there's vehicle damage. And so to fix it, you have to go with like a glass of water and a paintbrush and actually kind of turn it into mud again and get rid of the marks. And so we were able to work with NASA to give them literally the shoes that astronauts use on the moon to not leave footprints. So they could start to work on that. And a drone so they could better see what was out there that needed to be fixed, not only in the Nazca lines, but also other cultural sites that were difficult to reach because of jungle cover or rocky mountainous areas and things like that. We were able to bring a superintendent from one of our national parks here in the US to help work with. There are a couple of sites in Peru that are both UNESCO heritage sites and also national parks. And we here in the US have similar arrangement with a couple of our parks. And there's this delicate balance between allowing for tourism, creating a secure environment, et cetera, but still meeting the UNESCO heritage obligations of protecting the site. And so this is a really big issue at Machu Picchu, where people want to visit, and it's an important economic driver, but all of the visiting is degrading the actual site. So we were able to build this partnership with the Department of Interior here and to help them work with the Peruvians on ideas and sharing about how do you best protect and but still celebrate these types of parks. And also things like, and we have this problem too, criminals, right, want to cut through the park or take things out of the park, and how do you protect them while still making them open spaces for people to enjoy? So we were taking on really complicated issues about the environment, about the economy. We had many programs that dealt with really complex issues related to race, which is very complicated in Peru. And at the time, they were preparing for a census that would ask people the question of race for the first time ever. And so we were working with many different communities about that. We were working on questions of identity, sexual identity, and gender. There are places, particularly in the Amazon, that have different cultural ideas about gender and identity than, say, places along the coast that may be more influenced by Western religious practices and things like that. And so these ideas were coming into conflict, especially as it was reflected in who was being elected, say, to mayoral positions or local legislative positions. There were some controversies related to that. We this was also a time when the US this was during the protests in Ferguson. Uh, and so we're taking on all of these issues, but also needing to think about ways to explain our own and be honest about our own positions and what was going on in our country. We were there for the 2016 election, and Obama had a visit scheduled for APEC the week after the election. And so it was a period where we really had to explain American democracy in a way that I think people hadn't been challenged to explain it before. We just had a wonderful team. And because we had so many visits, I also got opportunities to travel to other countries to help with those visits. So during that period, I was able to go to Cuba and work um, for several weeks with the team that was helping prepare for President Obama to visit Cuba during that historic visit. And I'll always be thankful that I was there during that time. It was my first time in Cuba, but it was, I think, a really unique and amazing time to be there. It was a moment of hope about what the bilateral relationship was going to be, and a moment of openness that I don't know if we'll see for a long time. But I got to see and experience many things during that trip that I'm thankful that I was able to do.
Fascinating. What came after your assignment to Peru?
Mm. So we came back to Peru. Or after Peru, I went back to the operations center because I love it. And I was the deputy director there. And uh that was a that was a difficult period. Um I arrived in the operations center about 3 months after the inauguration. And so it was a I think a difficult transition for building. Lots of senior leaders at that moment were leaving or being pushed out. I talk about that time like I tell people it's like if you were at a family reunion and all of a sudden everyone from the generation of your grandparents and your aunts and uncles and your parents just disappeared. That's what it felt like being at the department during that period. All of a sudden, the people who were in leadership, the people who were being groomed for the next generation of leadership, they were just gone. Or they were pushed aside in spaces where they couldn't lead. Um, the operations center had this unique space of being very intertwined with the office of the secretary while still not being of it. And so when you enter a big bureaucracy like the State Department, it's the things that you can see that feel like they're the easiest things to demonstrate your power or use as a symbol of what you would like the rest of the organization to be. And that's kind of what happened to us during that period. Is we were the thing that was right there in front of the new leaders. And so we were a thing they could experiment with. What if we cut staff in this way or change hours that way, or things that you wouldn't normally expect people at that level to be involved in um, became the norm. And it was very disruptive for the processes of the operations center. I'm not sure, frankly, if we've recovered from that. Um, it was disruptive. It was difficult for the staff. It was definitely the leadership challenge of a lifetime, right? Um, Having to lead the staff through things like you signed up for this, but now I have to tell you you're going to do that. Like, for example, you signed up for a position in which you would work this certain number of days a week and these certain number of hours, but actually you're now going to work 12 hours, which is culturally not the norm at the State Department, right? People do technically work 12, 15, 18-hour days, but officially I think it's a different thing to be told you're going to work 12 hours. Um, Stuff like that was sudden, like it's starting tomorrow, not starting 6 weeks from now, and we'll talk about it like tomorrow. That was hard for folks. I think some of the ways in which they were treated and spoken to was surprising for them and hard for them. Many people who work at the working level in the operations center are that Belinda we talked about earlier in the conversation. They're on their second or third tour at the State Department. They're they're very early in their careers. Um, they don't have a lot of background experience to compare it to. And so therefore they don't have a deep well of resilience often to draw from because I think resilience builds with context and experience. So that was hard. And I think leading the team through that. When I was done there, I went to be deputy chief of mission during or in Kigali. Uh, and so when I landed in Kigali, we thought we had an Ebola crisis happening in Eastern Congo. Right? We thought literally my third day. Um, it was people will say that it's a small embassy. It's not. It's like a medium-sized embassy that we're treating as small. So there were medium-sized embassy problems both internally and externally. Rwanda is a very complex environment in which to work. I thankfully had a really great ambassador in Peter Vroman, who was a really great mentor and a great leader. And then COVID happened, and that there's no playbook on how to lead an embassy during COVID. So that was hard, right? Suddenly it was, yes, when you're a deputy chief of mission or you're a chief of mission, you're kind of responsible for everyone and your goal is to keep everybody alive and not ask people to do things that are too dangerous. But this was a keep everybody alive in a different kind of way. Let's keep everybody alive, but somehow still do our work. Suddenly our mission, everybody was given the opportunity to evacuate if they felt that the medical facilities were not adequate where they were. And I will say that I strongly urged as many people as I could, including my own family, to leave. Because that moment, it was not clear what the medical care was going to be like in Rwanda or what the situation was going to be like. And I think ultimately that's still the right decision. Then it meant that there were very few of us left. I think 10 out of maybe 100 American staff stayed. My family was gone. The ambassador's family stayed. I don't know. I don't know what the right decision was for me. But that was really hard. Uh, at the time, my daughter was in second grade, and she and my husband were in the DC area in a hotel. We have a lot of family in this area, but during those first few months of the pandemic, it was very difficult even to get around to see family. And so they were very isolated. Right? Um, and I was very isolated. In Rwanda, there was a very strict lockdown, which in many respects I appreciate, but I was alone in my house for like a couple of months. And that was very hard. So, in the end, ultimately, and also my daughter got very sick. It was not COVID related, but she ultimately needed a surgery that she could not get, because children's hospitals here in the US were only dealing with extreme emergencies to lower the risk to kids. So she was not able, that they left in March. She was not able to get that surgery until July. I was not able to make it back to the US until July. There were no flights happening in and out of Rwanda. And ultimately, I was able to get on a World Food Program charter flight, that went, I felt like, all around the world, but eventually landed at Dulles. Like, we eventually got here. Um, and then I was here for a couple of months while we figured out how to negotiate with the government of Rwanda to begin to allow diplomats to return, which we ultimately did. But by that time, it was clear that my family, um, it had just been really hard on us. And my husband and daughter really wanted to be just kind of settled here in the US, especially as her health was kind of, we weren't sure which direction it was going to go in. So I decided to return to the US. I came back in January of that year. Like, we went back to Rwanda, packed our things, said goodbye to folks, helped transition the mission. I came back here. I was director of public diplomacy for the Africa Bureau. I was briefly acting DAS for that, or acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy for Africa. And then just uh, around that time, I got asked to return to the Operations Center as director this time. Um, so I started in the Operations Center as director on the day that Kabul fell. Like, they called me and said, like, come to the department right now. Like, Kabul just fell. And just take over. Right. And I had to walk out on the ops center floor. And the folks, even though I had left maybe less than 2 years earlier, it's a 1 year turnover. So nobody knew me. And I had to like walk out onto the operations center floor. It's, think of it, kind of like what you see on TV, right? Like, when you think of, some kind of command center, and just say, hi, you don't know me, but I'm Belinda. I'm your new boss. Uh, Kabul just fell, and we've got to begin to evacuate. At the time, we thought our staff out of Kabul, and nobody's going to make an official announcement today because everybody's freaking out, running around and in meetings. So you're going to have to take my word for it. This random Black woman standing in front of you that you've never seen is your boss. And here's what we're going to do. So that, made me the first African American woman to lead the State Department Operations Center. Harry Thomas had been, oh, no, he hadn't been director. Uh, oh, I can't think of his name, but there had been an African American director when I was first in the State Department. Um, he later went to be an ambassador. I'll think of his name in a few minutes. But yeah, so that's how that went. And we made it through Afghanistan, and we were getting ready for Ukraine. And then I was recruited to do this tech thing. So I left.
As in, you resigned your commission or retired, or
At that point, I had enough years to retire, but I didn't have the age. So technically, I'm in this kind of in between space. I resigned, but I will have my pension and benefits once I reach a certain age.
what an incredible experience.
It was
I
fun.
wonder, Belinda, if you would take a moment And even as we've looked at your past, I'd like you to think about folks in the future who will be watching this recording and speak to the future of what you think about careers in international affairs and what you might say to that person watching.
I think the future is in international affairs. I don't regret for a day spending my career in international affairs. And I think what I wish I had done a bit differently is think not so much about what is hot today, but what are tomorrow's challenges. One, I wish I had thought about what are the most intractable, difficult challenges. And we all have these, we're all very smart people. What could I be using this brain to really work on and be a part of? I wish I had looked at more opportunities to build external policy relationships. As a public diplomacy officer, I have amazing contacts all around the world in arts and culture, and I love that, and I'm thankful for it. But I do wish that I had also both taken and had opportunities to build external policy and economic contacts. But I will say that certainly I felt in my career, those kinds of roles were indirectly and directly blocked from me, right? I now realize that now that I'm older and wiser and outside of the department, how valuable those kinds of positions are. They are literally valuable. People are paid for their Rolodexes, for their contacts, for the information that they have. And so keeping people like me out of those kinds of roles is strategic in the long term. And I tell people to think about a mix of those as well in critical spaces, right? So being the, I don't know, economic officer in charge of, AGOA, the trade treaty affairs in a small West African country with a small um, trade relationship with the US, while interesting, may not be as valuable as doing it in, say, a Cote d'Ivoire or a Ghana or Nigeria or Senegal kind of space, right? So I think that whether we like it or not, whether people like it or not, the world, as COVID even showed us, is so interrelated and connected, even when people don't want it to be, that having that being in international affairs is quite valuable, that having really great interpersonal skills and being able to develop relationships is really important to your success in this field. And really thinking strategically more, at least a step ahead. You can always change. Most of what I described in my career, the parts I've left out are I just walked constantly through open doors. I just went where I was wanted. I often had a plan that was different. Even the plan from the beginning, I'm going to be a lawyer and I'm going to go to Japan and I'm going to work for like Coca-Cola and then I'll come back and be a politician, but a different door opened and I thought, why not? Right? Having a yes and attitude about this career will take you so far. And, so my advice is it is a valuable career to have, but in order to succeed in it, you've got to be a little bit strategic and you also have to be flexible and adaptable and open-minded.
Thank you for sharing your insights and your lived experience. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.